Alright, so for today, I wanted to give you a bit of an introduction to the judicial branch. Um, this component is actually also going to be broken up into two sections. This is going to be section 1, of course. And section 1 will really mostly talk about the structure of the judicial branch and how the different levels of courts all sort of relate to one another. So let's just go ahead and jump right in. So basically, the structure of the federal courts here is sort of set up like a pyramid. And so this pyramid's like this. It's kind of, if you're envisioning this pyramid, it kind of goes like this. So the top of the pyramid here is the United States Supreme Court. And there's only one. So when you talk about the Supreme Court, there's just, the justices on the Supreme Court. There's only one court, that's it. And it's at the very, very top. But below this level, there are the United States Court of Appeals, and there are actually 12 of these in the United States. So they're spread around throughout the states, so that people can have access to this level. And then below that are what's known as district courts, and this is sort of your very bottom level of your courts. There's 94 district courts within the actual U.S. states. But there's also, within the district courts, we also consider there to be like local courts and state courts. That sort of falls under this, but when we talk about like the lowest level of courts, we sort of talk about district courts and local courts sort of at the same time. And just to let you know the way that the cycle works, and we will explain this a little bit in the next slide, but generally what happens is that court cases sort of start at the lowest level. So if you have a problem and you feel like it needs to go to court, it'll start at the lowest level. So you'll take your issue to court. And if for whatever reason they aren't able to give you a solution to this problem, or you decide that you want to appeal the case, like you feel like you weren't treated fairly, you want someone else to give it a listen to, then what you'll do is you'll appeal it here, and then it'll jump up a level. And then you'll take your stuff, and then you'll have an opportunity to hear it at this level. And usually after appeals, they obviously go to the Court of Appeals, right? And then after it's been appealed, usually they'll be able to sort it out here. It doesn't normally take to go through the whole process, through the whole pyramid to figure it out. Usually it'll end here. But if for whatever reason these guys disagree with the lower courts, or if it's like a Bill of Rights issue, or if it's a bigger deal than they're able to handle, then what will happen is you can appeal here and then jump it up to the Supreme Court. And that's sort of the general way that that works. You kind of start from the bottom and you work your way up through this process of the courts. And so, of course, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, 90% of these court cases that ever happen, 90% of them start at district court. So they start at this lower level. And really what that is here's your first key term that I'm going to have you remember is original jurisdiction. And district courts are courts of original jurisdiction. And what original jurisdiction means is that if the court has original jurisdiction, then that means that they have the power to hear the case for the very first time. Not all courts have the power of original jurisdiction, but the district courts do. They have the power to hear the case for the first time. And so generally the kinds of cases that you'll hear or that will be managed through district courts, first is they'll get a lot of civil cases. So a civil case is one in which people are trying to get sued. This is for like a ticket or someone didn't pay their rent. If you ever see like Judge Judy or any of those shows, they're all civil because they all are like some kind of grievance somebody has, and the punishment is a fine or being sued. But also at district courts, you'll see criminal cases, and this is the stuff where sometimes obviously people can be fined, but this is the kind of stuff where people get imprisoned or they go to jail. So like things that are breaking criminal law. But also, some of the cases that you'll see for original jurisdiction will be constitutional cases, so issues that violate the Constitution. These, though, generally will go directly to the Supreme Court, but they are, of course, original jurisdiction stuff. But we will talk a little bit more about that in a second. So Basically, I mentioned this a little earlier. If either side of a case doesn't like a verdict that happens at the district courts at that lowest level of the pyramid, they have the ability to appeal or to request a higher court hear it. It's sort of like if you're at school and you bring an issue to Mr. Biggs, and and I give you an answer, and you're like, Mr. Biggs' answer is stupid. I'm going to ask Mr. Johnson. That's sort of like an appeal. You say that you don't really like my answer or you don't agree with my answer, and you take it a level up. And that's sort of what you do in the courts. And of course, after the district court level, it takes it to the Court of Appeals because you're appealing it, right? Now, the Court of Appeal does not have original jurisdiction. They do not have the right to hear cases for the first time. The Court of Appeals, so that second level of that pyramid, they only ever hear cases that are appealed from the lower level. Nobody ever takes a case directly to that middle level. It has to be appealed from a lower court. And so generally they will only ever be dealing with issues that are unresolved or potentially a little bit more difficult. So hopefully you would expect to see a little bit higher or more experienced level of judges to be at this particular case. The other thing to mention about district courts is when you're thinking about district courts and you're thinking about what a room looks like in the middle of a court case. And you think of having lawyers, and you think of judges, and you think of juries and all that. At the district level, that's generally true. At the district level, that's what it looks like. They have the judge. They have lawyers for the people on each side. They, sometimes will have audience members, and they have a jury. But at the Court of Appeals, they only have 3 judges and no jury. So basically, they just sort of assume that at the district court, they've already done that whole process. So here, they just get 3 experts just to hear the case and take evidence from the arguments from what had happened at the previous level, and then they just base it on that. And then finally, if you don't like what happened to the results of your case at that Court of Appeals, it is possible to go ahead and appeal again. And then if you successfully appeal, they decide to grant you your appeal, then your case will go to the United States Supreme Court, the highest court in the land. It's also known here as the court of last resort because this is it. Whatever the Supreme Court says goes. There is no ability to appeal once the United States Supreme Court makes a decision. The only way to change a Supreme Court decision is by having a similar topic that's a little bit different potentially come through the courts later, which actually is sort of challenging because if the Supreme Court makes a decision and then a similar case comes up, they'll just automatically say that the previous decision just holds. Supreme Court decisions in some ways sort of become law that way. That if there's a decision made here, then that just becomes the way in which all future situations that are similar will be judged the same way. Kind of almost becomes law. So the only way to change this is really through an amendment to the Constitution. But once again, for the Supreme Court, there is only one court. It is in Washington, D.C. It has 1 Chief Justice and 8 Associate Justices. So there are, of course, 9 for those of you that may not be as skilled at counting. So the cases that these guys generally see, oftentimes they will see, cases that were appealed from state Supreme Courts. And if the states are having a hard time with it and it gets appealed, then the Supreme Court will get it. Or if people appeal from the Court of Appeals, then they'll get those issues too. But the Supreme Court does have original jurisdiction if a case is related to a dispute between the U.S. and a foreign country. So obviously, if there's a court case between like France and the United States, it wouldn't go to like the Napa local court, right? Like Napa doesn't have jurisdiction, doesn't have the ability to like manage issues related to international events. But the Supreme Court is considered the court of the whole country. So generally with international stuff or sometimes even state-to-state stuff, they will handle it here. And then really, it's worth saying that the Supreme Court really dismisses most cases. Very, very few cases make it all the way to the Supreme Court. A lot of people will propose cases to the Supreme Court. They constantly have people trying to get court cases to go there, but a lot of them are just dismissed. The Supreme Court will say, no, the previous folks at the Court of Appeals, they were right. We're sticking to that agreement. It's fine. Or they will just not take it and let whatever the previous agreement, on that particular issue was hold. Obviously, they don't have the ability to just dismiss international stuff because there is no other court. But oftentimes they're dismissed. In fact, about 10,000 requests for Supreme Court decisions are made every year, but only 100 of them are ever actually scheduled to be heard by the Supreme Court. So it's pretty interesting the way that the process works. A lot of cases start at the very bottom. A lot of people end up being unhappy through the process. Sometimes they'll try to send them to the Supreme Court. But generally, the Supreme Court's pretty happy to just say the previous thing that they said is fine, and we don't feel like we need to hear it again. All right, so this is where I'm going to stop it for part 1. We will dig a little bit more deeply into what kinds of things that they do and how it functions in the next video.